Well, welcome to the year-end edition of what we call Flying Sloppy, which is our tongue-in-cheek description of the fact that we all, as pilots, can do a better job in the cockpit. And with us for this year's final episode are our incredible experts, astronaut Charlie Precourt, who's chairman of the CJP Safety Committee, and Mr. Neil Singer, mentor extraordinaire, designated examiner, and CJP safety consultant. Did I get all that right?
That'll world
I think you did, David. Not bad.
We're taping this on December 17th, and Neil, I think you told me and Charlie just a minute ago that you were shoveling snow just a couple of hours ago from Boston near your palatial residence in the Boston area. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right, David. We got a little dump overnight. I think you're going to splice in some images. Yeah,
and we're sure that it is you. Could either one of you guys explain to me 2020? Because I have no idea what's happened this year. It's just been a totally crazy year. Either one of you have a good explanation?
You may or may not know, but somebody sent me, today is actually the 5th anniversary of the year 2020. We are now 5 years into it.
Well,
that's a good way of thinking about it.
we know 2021 has got to be different. It can't be the same. But we thought in our ending session here that we would do a little potpourri of things that we were not able to address during the year, and kind of a discussion. So let's get right to it. One of the things that I noticed was that we've all had a lot of downtime this year to watch internet YouTube videos from our iPhone or our iPad or whatever, and a lot of aviation type stuff, some of which are really good and some of which are maybe not so good. I had the opportunity, I think you guys have seen it, to watch one recently, and the question came up, what's the most expensive time to copy a clearance? That's kind of a weird question, right? So the answer is the most expensive time to copy a clearance is when you're on the ramp really close to lots of airplanes and you're turning your airplane and starting your taxi out, because you have the opportunity to hit so many things and or people that's probably the most expensive time to do that. We have a clip of a video from a YouTuber, which we'll show you now, and not to be overly critical, except that there is probably not the best time to copy a clearance is when you're turning from a ramp. So let's show a couple seconds of that.
Billings transition asphalt. Climb by the SID. Departure frequency Big Sky 118.907. Squawk 6056.
So I'm sure that I know I've done exactly what I just saw. You guys have probably done it in your career too, but it's probably not the safest time. I know, Charlie, in the military, in the Air Force, for instance, some pilots, I think, were actually, if not trained, it was some procedure that you used a lot. You actually did copy clearances because you owned the airport in that case, all right?
I think you can, yes. As a matter of fact, in the Air Force, especially in the fighter community, we would start engines and taxi out as a formation, and it was not uncommon to catch things from the tower while you're taxiing, and for clearances or other instructions. I think it was never something that was trained or condoned. It was just something that we got accustomed to doing on occasion. It wasn't a conscious effort to say, thou shalt not do that. But as you look around our community and we get smarter every year about safety, it becomes pretty obvious that one of the best things to do is just be stopped, have park and brake on, and be fully attentive to what's being said to you, so you don't have to be multitasking. We've had many issues with airplanes running into other airplanes on the ramp, so you're just adding to the likelihood of that. I will say that in the case of what we did in the military, we're operating off of a military base. We pretty much own the ramp, right? There's not thousands of different types of operations. It's all a military operation, and it becomes a lot more predictable. So we can get into habit patterns that are not necessarily bad in one situation, but can be pretty bad in another. So it's just a really great heads up for all of our folks to be thinking about what's the best idea? Like you say, where's the most expensive place to be copying your clearance?
And not to be too critical of this video we just showed, the same exact pilot on that video in a subsequent video had a copied a clearance on the ramp and stopped. Very convoluted clearance with probably 8 different waypoints and Victor Airways and intercepts, really difficult. And as he began his taxi out, he looked down at his camera that he broadcast to his followers and said something to the effect of, "I'm not going to be narrating this departure today because I am nearing task saturation," which I thought was a really great comment about how we can tell our passengers or the person in the right seat who asks questions at the absolute wrong time when we need to be focused on flying. Any of you have a comment about that?
I think that just shows great situational awareness, is focusing on the priority task as it comes to you and making sure you don't allow unnecessary distractions. As a matter of fact, I think we're going to talk more about that here in a bit with other examples. But I always liked the video that Neil did about Ready for Recurrent, where he did a scenario where he raised the gear at the same time the tower made a call to him, and it was really evident that he was focused on flying the airplane first, aviate, navigate, communicate. He didn't answer the tower till he cleaned up the airplane, got things settled, and then he went to the radio. So he was aviating and he was navigating, and then he finally communicated. And that, I'm pretty sure that video is either Ready for Recurrent, or it was the one where he kind of took your scenario flying out of Addison, David, where you had that sudden call as you were going through an altitude level off, right?
Right.
Managing the scoreboard. So it may have been the scoreboard video, but in any event, I think it's a great example of someone who showed they had sharp situational awareness and where they were going to put their priorities.
Neil, another one that we saw was a nighttime IMC approach to Telluride. And right at about minimums, the person occupying the right seat asked the pilot in command what V approach means. And they're getting into a discussion right at a really difficult time on the approach. You want to comment about that?
Sure. I think the three of us all felt from watching the video that the pilot in the right seat was probably a pilot, seemed to be pretty experienced with aviation, but maybe not familiar with this specific airplane or with jet flying in general. And we particularly felt like this was an important topic to bring up, given some of the conversation recently our members have had about insurance, perhaps becoming harder to get single pilot, dictating use of an SIC. 2 pilots can be more than one, but 2 pilots can also be less than one if the situation isn't really briefed, set up, and there's not standard procedures. Just in my own experience, I flew as many young professional pilots do for a 135 outfit, flying a mix of turboprops and jets. And there was absolutely no crew standardization. So every pilot did things their own way, had different call outs, and it was really a human factors nightmare. My next job was for a large regional airline. I could fly with any one of the 3,000 pilots in that company, and we knew exactly what the person was going to do when, what certain call outs meant, night and day. So again, using a second pilot can be an incredible increase in safety, but it's really important that the 2 pilots brief ahead of time, spend some really good amount of time talking about who's going to do what, division of labor, when we're going to have a sterile cockpit, only talk about essential items, so that we're not ending up in a situation where that pilot's detracting from situational awareness, increasing workload.
That's good. That's good. Very good comment. Charlie, I think a lot of us have seen the recent Citation 2 landing accident in Lufkin, Texas. I think we're going to show a couple of seconds of that, where the pilot goes off the end of the runway. Airplane was significantly totaled, and we'll show some pictures of that. We're going to go into that accident and contaminated runways a lot next year, as well as the go-around decision, how we make that or why we don't make it in some cases. But I know you have a myth you want to debunk about something called aerobraking. What in the heck is aerobraking?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And yes, I think for those who maybe haven't seen that video yet, we'll show that here in a minute. And maybe even haven't seen some of the early reports of the accident. It's gaining some notoriety because one of the passengers was the Speaker of the House of the Texas Legislature. And they were on a flight, I think it was out of Austin into Lufkin, not a very long flight, 40 minutes or so. But there was heavy rain north of the field, and it actually came down on the field in the 8 minutes prior to landing. They had heavy rain. They elected to land on the shorter of the two runways, one would suspect probably because it was closer to the ramp. And we will dissect this accident. And Textron is on the scene doing their usual analysis, and we'll learn a lot from that. And as we dissect it, we'll look at a lot of different pieces, one of which would be the hydroplaning aspect of landing on a wet runway. Contaminated runways, we talk about that a lot. In speaking about the hydroplaning piece, I wanted to bring up what I call folklore or myths, as you say. And we all ought to make sure that we are attentive to the fact that those things creep in. Myths develop, and we should debunk them as quickly as we can so that they don't become accepted erroneously. And I have been asked by some of our citation drivers in the community about aerobraking when landing on wet or snow-covered runways. Would it not be better to do that rather than jumping on the brakes and in fact experiencing hydroplaning? And so the technique that developed out of that was anytime you're in one of those situations, just plan to aerobrake. And so I did a little bit of that on a dry runway, a very nice day, long runway, to experiment with how much do you not gain from doing that. And the reason that you would hear of aerobraking is, and I'll show some videos of this in just a minute, but the reason you would do some aerobraking has to do with other types of jet aircraft, particularly some of the faster military fighter aircraft. Your hydroplaning speed is 9 times the square root of tire pressure. So conveniently for the Textron products, they have tire pressures that will avoid exceeding that speed where hydroplaning will occur, because we take a lot of the 525s are in the 100 PSI range for their tire inflation pressure. And you should be always checking your tire pressure and filling it to the high end of the limit, because the hydroplaning speed, in this case, 9 times the square root of pressure, tire pressure would be 90 knots. So, you know, our VREF and then our touchdown speeds most often put us to where we would be at or below that speed, and you shouldn't run into hydroplaning. But it can happen if you land fast or if your tire pressure is low. And although we don't know what happened in this particular accident, there was a setup to potentially cause hydroplaning. And the discussions in the past I've had about wouldn't you want to just aerobrake come to mind as something we ought to make sure people don't intentionally go trying to do, because as you'll see in these videos, it has essentially no positive effect. And in the fighter jets that I've flown that land at higher speeds, we intentionally aerobrake because at the higher speeds, the aerobraking effectiveness is better because the drag of air friction is higher. But once you get down to the speeds down below 100 knots, most airplanes, you don't get a whole lot out of an aerobraking effect, and you're much, much better off to be doing what the manufacturer says, which is land, and as the test pilots did in our data, within 1 second of touchdown, they have maximum braking and ground flaps applied, or speed brakes, depending on the model. Let me show those two videos, because it's pretty, I think, obvious that you really don't benefit much from aerobraking in these particular types of airplanes. So here's an airport diagram of the Boise runway. The two approaches I do back to back on the same day are to runway 10 right. You can see that's a 9,700 foot long runway, and the normal turnoff to the ramp would be taxiway Delta to go over to the FBO side of the field on the west side there, northwest side. And so I'm going to make two successive approaches here. One will be a normal landing with a turnoff, and the next one will look almost identical, but I will intentionally aero brake. Since you can't see the airspeed indicator, I'm going to be calling out the airspeeds during the maneuver. On both, you'll hear me calling out speeds as I decelerate. Note that this is for a CJ1 Plus. I think it's very representative of our citations, though. The actual speeds and the deceleration rates might be slightly different, obviously, but I think you'll get the picture here. So let me show you those two videos. So this first one is a normal landing, and we're about 100 feet or so, maybe 150 feet in the air on our final approach. And I tried to make both of these approaches look identical in terms of speed and altitude across the threshold and touchdown.
Minimums.
So there's 50 feet at the threshold.
Gears down. Squeaked it on, flaps, land, and braking. We are 60 knots at 7,000 remaining.
So 60 knots at 7,000 remaining.
Left here next. Is that okay? Station 3 Bravo, affirmative, left turn at Golf, cross runway 10 left, taxi, are going to Jackson.
Yes, sir, Jackson. Golf, and understand we can cross the left.
Delta 1552, contact.
So you can see I had 60 knots with 7,000 feet remaining, and the turnoff was with about 5,500 feet remaining. A very easy, with this kind of long runway, not an issue whatsoever. So let's now look at the aerobraking one. Same initial starting point.
Ops 29, roger, off, thanks.
Minimums.
50 feet at the threshold.
Okay, 8,000 feet is the touchdown spot. Aerobraking. 87 knots at 7,000.
You're holding the nose off, right, Charlie?
I'm holding the nose off.
77 knots at 6,000.
And squawk 4321.
75 knots at 5,000. So essentially, not much coming off the jet.
Final approach speeding, then you.
So pretty dramatic difference where I was already down to taxi speed crossing that first intersection. I had, with the braking normally per the OEM, I had 60 knots at 7,000 feet. I still had 75 knots with 5,000 to go. So I gave up a good 2,500 feet of runway trying to aerobrake. So not a good plan. I do not know of a point in time when we would want to use an aerobraking technique for this jet, because as I say, with 9 times the square root of the tire pressure, if you're touching down below 90, 95 knots, the technique in these landings should be a firm landing. If you're especially landing on contaminated runways, get the tires to hit the concrete, get wheel spin up, and get into your braking. And we'll talk more about this when we analyze that particular accident where they ran off the runway. But for anybody who wonders about aerobraking, there you have it. It really doesn't do much for us.
And Charlie, we actually, in some other research we did on FOQA, we had a series of pilots who were attempting to receive applause from their passengers, and their culture was to hold the nose off a little longer so they'd have a very soft touchdown, in effect aerobraking, and they were using a lot more runway than they even actually realized. It's very similar to that, right?
It's a little different. Aerobraking is really defined as the point after the main wheels touch where you intentionally hold the angle of attack you have at touchdown, or in many cases you increase it without lifting off again. And you're using the aerodynamic drag of the full on fuselage and wing at a higher angle of attack to slow you down. And again, that works at jets that land at 135 knots and they want to get down below 100 before they start using braking. It's pretty dang effective. But even in a lot of those jets that have the ability to, with higher tire pressures, to not have a hydroplaning issue, the better choice when you really need to stop shorter is to get the nose down and get on braking. But yeah, what you're exploring there was when you're holding it off, you're giving up a lot of runway without being able to decelerate using the deceleration devices, ground flaps, speed brakes, and wheel brakes most importantly. And so the idea of squeaking it on is nice when you've got 15,000 feet of runway and you could afford to do that. But I never like giving up runway behind me. It's just not a good policy. even if you squeak it on a long runway and you end up blowing a tire later, or you have a brake failure later in the rollout, you will have wished you had done a more normal landing. And so getting a firm touchdown when you have a contaminated runway, get the wheel spin up going, get the nose down, get the flaps deployed, and the speed brakes deployed, and getting on the brakes is always the best policy.
That's great. Really great info. That's really great. Neil, I know that this month your operative word is confirm. What do you mean?
Well, yeah, exactly. We're going to show a couple short videos, and it's a pretty common theme across them. But really what we're saying here is most of our members are flying single pilot. The airlines years ago changed the nomenclature from pilot flying and pilot not flying to pilot flying and pilot monitoring, because they realized that's really the most important job that the non-flying pilot was doing, was monitoring. Well, when we're operating single pilot, we have to be our own monitor. So it requires a little more deliberate monitoring. If we just perform an action, move on to our next task, we're really counting on ourselves to have done it right the first time. So forcing ourselves to slow the cadence down a little bit, to confirm everything we've done, a few examples we're going to show specifically, could have a huge net safety effect. So this is our first of our 4 short videos here, and we were actually just talking about taxi clearances. When receiving a taxi clearance, it's good practice to write it down using a shorthand that's comfortable and familiar with you rather than relying on memory. And I can just share a story that happened to me just in the last few weeks. I was flying a light jet single pilot, and at Hanscom Airport, you almost always get the same taxi instructions back to the ramp. And there was an aircraft coming out opposite direction. So they gave me a very non-standard taxi instruction, and I wrote it down. And then as soon as I wrote it down, I looked at it and said, wait, what are they saying? And then, looked at the taxi diagram and realized why they were giving it to me. But had I not wrote the instruction down, it would be very easy to understand how you just have your normal muscle memory. I've cleared the runway at this point, I'm going to this ramp, and just start taxiing on autopilot, so to speak.
That's a good one.
I had my first shuttle commander was a guy by the name of Steve Nagel, and he had an amazing discipline that whenever he was listening to a controller on the radio, and that was whether we were in the shuttle or in the T-38, he wrote it down every single time for every single clearance, a radio frequency change, a heading and an altitude change, the clearance on the ground, the clearances throughout the flight. And I always marveled at his discipline to do that. And I think it's a really good practice. If you can get into that practice and get comfortable with it, it's really helpful.
Good point.
Okay, so our second one is staying on the taxi theme here. And we're going to talk about, before we even start moving, making sure we understand what the taxi clearance says. When you receive a taxi clearance, it's always a good idea to verify it against the chart before you start moving, to make sure the route makes sense to you, and clarify with ATC before you taxi. And that example I just gave was a great example of where that could help out, where you're used to getting a certain clearance. And when they say Tango Echo Sierra Juliet, if you actually look at it on the chart, you might realize, oh, they're going to have me essentially do a 180 and double back so I can get out of somebody else's way. But if you didn't take the time to look at that on the chart, you're not going to be able to visualize that. Our next video talks about the status bar, or as it's more informally known, the scoreboard, one of my favorite subjects to talk about with pilots. Immediately following a change to the autopilot or flight director status, confirm on the status bar. Nav is selected, nav is indicated. And a little mea culpa here. Just in the last few weeks, again, I was flying a light jet single pilot, and I was given a heading for 30 or 40 miles and then told to go back direct to whatever the last fix I'd been navigating was. And I turned the heading bug back towards the fix, hit direct on the FMS, and then got distracted by a frequency change and a new controller, and I never went back to nav mode. So again, we're all human. We all make mistakes. So regularly confirming, am I supposed to be in heading mode? Am I supposed to be in nav mode? In this case, I was going towards the waypoint, so I was essentially tracking the course, but I was in heading mode. And had the winds been strong, that could have been a bad situation where I might have been blown off course before I realized it.
And I think, Neil, to your point, it's a matter of confirming that every single time and not most of the time, because we've had members of our organization and pilots that we have known have had fatal accidents because they did not confirm the action that they took on the scoreboard. So it has to be something that is almost as rote as gear down, and you keep your finger on the gear handle or on the lights until you see the 3 green. In other words, you're confirming, absolutely confirming it. We need to have that same mentality with the scoreboard.
Yeah, absolutely. David, I gave 6 check rides last week, 6158 checks in a type ride. And that's one of the most common things I see. Pilots get task saturated and they hit the heading button twice and now they're in roll mode because they turned heading off right after they turned it on, or they hit the wrong button. And an experienced pilot is always able to catch it in time before the course deviates far from where they want to be. But you could certainly see that that's potentially the first chain in a link leading towards an accident if you don't catch it. So it's incredibly easy to do. Any pilot on any given flight is likely to make some sort of mode slip up. So making that confirmation inherent practice every single time is really critical and essential. This is another pet peeve of mine. This drives me crazy when I see pilots look at the gear handle, look at the flap handle. When confirming an item on a checklist or a flow that has an indication on the MFD or elsewhere in the cockpit, confirm both the selector and the indication. For example, in the case of the gear, both the gear handle is down and the gear indication is 3 green. Or the flaps, the handle is indicating 0 and the indicator is indicating 0. Just confirming the selector can lead to a mistake. And we've talked before in another video we made about, for the CJ series, I know sim instructors will often fail the flaps. Pilots will put the flaps to the landing position and not notice that that little indicator tab isn't moving with it. And I've been in the sim with pilots who have flown the whole approach at VREF, not realizing that they had a flap failure, and the sim instructor had to pause and back up to do the 0 flap landing because they just looked at the handle instead of looking at the indicator. So again, whether it's the parking brake, the landing gear, the flaps, a system indication, what you interface with is not the same as what has actually happened always. Usually it is, and that's just enough to lead us into a sense of complacency, but the time it's not is the time you really want to know it.
Great info, thank you. Charlie, Neil mentioned in our last video that he and a crew member took off and forgot to raise the flaps at the appropriate time. You have a solution for that, right?
I have a solution. Yeah, I have a technique.
What is it?
This comes into what I like to talk about from time to time about details of crew resource management applied to the single pilot. The FAA talks about single pilot resource management, and with a crew, you've got somebody there backing you up. So what are the things that are backing you up when you're not in a crewed situation? So I always try to find other things that can back me up. If I'm going to an airport where there's snow forecast, I'm 100 miles out, I'll talk to the ground controller because he's my backup. How's it doing? Is it snowy there? Or I got an issue? In the case of some of the things that Neil just talked about with respect to, dynamic phases of flight right after takeoff, we have checklists to run. Having a timer back you up as a reminder to go back and check things is a really good idea. And that's what I do after every takeoff is I use the timer in a very specific way, and I'll show you that. I think Neil had an instance where he got task saturated and was late getting the flaps up. I had one where I almost overran the 5 minutes in takeoff power because I got a similar distraction. And so what I do now is I use the timers in a special way to help me prevent that. And this is for the Proline models, but after every landing, I will go ahead and set up my timer, and I'll show you how I do that here with this quick little video.
All right, so as a technique after landing for the checklist, I like to reset the timer in the flight timer window for 3 minutes for the next flight, so it's already there. Just flew an hour and a half, so we're going to press and hold till we zero out that time. And then we hit both buttons to allow it to reset, and we select the single digits column, and we go 1, 2, 3 minutes, and then we take it to 0, and then we set it on the flight timer window, and it's at 0, ready to count up to 3.
So once we've done that, then it's ready for the next flight, and this is what it looks like 3 minutes, 2.5 minutes into the flight. I'm not really paying any attention to it, but you'll see what happens here in about 5 or 10 seconds.
There's the flasher, and then all I got to do is punch it off and acknowledge that flaps are retracted and we're out of takeoff thrust.
So it's a good reminder to get back to that after takeoff checklist where things like flaps or power settings can get forgotten. And again, this is kind of a technique for single pilot resource management. You should be using all those things to back you up that you can. In my situation, I was taken off out of Tucson, I think it was, where the controller interrupted me about restricted airspace associated with the military training areas. And it was right at the time that I normally would have been pulling power back. And I went another minute or so because I had an unrestricted climb, another minute or so before I realized I hadn't finished that checklist. And so that's a bad deal, right? And so having that timer now is flashing there pretty brightly at you. It's a very, very big help.
That's a good reminder. Thanks, Charlie. I wanted to say something about helicopters, something that I know almost nothing about. I've flown in them a couple times, but never piloted them. And I saw a video that many people may have seen very recently also of a rotor striking a person on the ground at night, killing them instantly. A person approaching the helicopter from the front. I knew, of course, that helicopters have rotors and they come close to the ground, but I had no idea they would come as close to the ground as they can. And so I wanted to pass along that to our members who have helicopters. That's no news to them at all, but there may be some members who have children or loved ones that get involved with helicopters, and they may be as ignorant as I am or was about the helicopter safety and being the appropriate distance from those rotors. Neil, I think you had a comment about that you wanted to say too.
Yeah, just a couple weeks ago, I got a ride from a friend of mine to pick up his light jet, and he flew me in his helicopter. He has a Eurocopter, a light turbine. So this isn't a small helicopter. You know, this isn't like an R-44 or an R-66. A pretty good size helicopter, sits pretty high up. The rotor's pretty high off the ground. And he had to, I had to go leave my car over at the FBO, and his helicopter was on the other side of the field. And so, you know, we were trying to figure out, he ended up coming and picking me up in the car because he said, you know, if we had flown before in this helicopter together and I'd, you know, done the first flight with you, then we could think about doing a hot load and unload. But since you're not familiar with this helicopter and this is the first time, why don't I just come get you and we can just get you in the helicopter with the engine off. And again, this is a much bigger helicopter, but he very prudently said, you know, you've never seen this door. You've never understood exactly how high the rotor is. This was my first time in this particular helicopter with him. And so I think he made the absolutely responsible right choice to say, hey, it might take a little bit longer to drive around the field, but that's the smarter thing to do. So yeah, it's really something to take seriously and not assume. A lot of what we have talked about is not assuming that the stars always align in the right manner, right? But understanding that something can often slip the chain and go wrong. And I think this is a great example of not assuming that someone's going to know how high they can safely stand, how to get in and out of the door, where the area of the tail that may be unsafe is. Don't make those assumptions.
Well, guys, this has been a fun year. We had no idea when we started 2020 that we'd be doing these. So I guess that's a side benefit of COVID, if there ever was one. I'm not sure, but it's been a pleasure working with you, and thank you for bringing all your expertise. I think now we're going to have to continue these because we've got something started and we have so many topics to talk about next year. So until then, you guys have a great Christmas. I have not received a gift from either one of you so far, but I'm sure there's enough shipping time if you go
Checks
out
in the
right
mail,
now.
David. Checks in the mail.
Okay, excellent. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you next year.
Thanks, David.
Thanks.
The CJP Safety and Education Foundation is committed to providing all pilots with the best tools to safely operate their airplane. Our content is always free of charge, and you can access it by clicking on the Safety tab on our website. Until next time, fly safe.